are only truly mastered when you learn how to pronounce the ED sound. In this lesson, we'll study the regular verbs. We'll study the irregular verbs in the next lesson. Theoretically, an upper intermediate student should be completely familiar with the past tense in English, although in practice, most students have trouble dealing with this tense, especially when trying to pronounce the ED of the regular verbs and the irregular forms. To correct these problems, we are going to extensively practice both the regular verbs in this lesson and the irregular verbs in the next lesson. Now, what are regular verbs? These are verbs that end in ED. Now let's see the structure of the simple past tense for regular and irregular verbs. Affirmative, subject plus verb plus object. Example, I talked to her yesterday. Negative, subject plus didn't plus infinitive of the verb without to plus object. Example, I didn't talk to her yesterday. Question, did plus subject plus infinitive of the verb without to plus object plus question mark. Example, did you talk to her yesterday? Negative question, did plus not plus subject plus infinitive of the verb without to plus object plus question mark. Example, didn't you talk to her yesterday? Answers. Examples. Yes, I did. No, I didn't. Remember that when we use did, the main verb always goes in infinitive. Now, when do we use the simple past tense? We use the simple past tense when we want to speak about finished actions that took place in the past. Example, she wanted to buy a car last year. She wanted is a finished action that took place in the past, last year. Let's see now how to pronounce the past tense of the regular verbs. We have already talked about the sounds of the regular verbs in lesson 3. But now, since you need to master these sounds, we'll go over them to make sure you understand them and can reproduce them correctly. All the grammar books give several rules about how to pronounce the ED sound of the regular verbs. But as there are so many, they are difficult to remember. Instead of remembering all these rules, I will ask you to remember just one. Do not pronounce the E of the ED ending. Just try to say D without adding any vowel sound. If you do this, you will naturally come up with the right sounds for the past tense of the regular verbs. Why is this so? Because when you try to say a D without saying the E, you need to adapt the muscles of your mouth to be able to pronounce the last letter before the E together with a D. For example, if you need to say talked, your last letter is a K. If you try to pronounce a D after the K without making any vowel sound, you'll get a T. Talk, in the past tense, sounds talked. For all of you who want to have a more detailed explanation of the ED sounds, we'll go a little bit deeper into the subject. The 3 different sounds of ED. The regular verbs can have 3 different sounds in the ending. 1, D, 2, id, and 3, T. As I said before, they take different sounds depending on the sound that comes before the ED sound. Let's see the different sounds. D. The verbs that end in L, V, N, M, R, B, V, G, W, Y, and Z, and vowel sound, diphthongs, use the D sound. I will now give you some examples. You'll see many more in the course material, lesson 11. Advice. Past tense, advised, aconsejar. Agree. Past tense, agreed, acordar. Allow. Past tense, allowed, permitir. Answer. Past tense, answered, responder. Appear. Past tense, appeared, aparecer. Arrive. Past tense, arrived, llegar. Id. Verbs that end in T or D use the id sound. I will now give you some examples. Afford, past tense, afforded, permitirse. Attend, past tense, attended, asistir. Arrest, past tense, arrested, arrestar. Collect, past tense, collected, recoger. Decide, past tense, decided, decidir. End, past tense, ended, acabar. T. Verbs that end in P, K, S, CH, SH, F, GH, X, H use the T sound. I will now give you some examples. Ask, past tense, asked, preguntar o pedir. Bake, past tense, baked, hornear. Cook, past tense, cooked, cocinar. Crack, past tense, cracked, agrietarse. Crash, past tense, crushed, chocar. Dress, past tense, dressed, vestirse. Please go now to chapter 8 of your audiobook and listen to it at least 2 times, then read it. As you'll see, I have highlighted the regular verbs in gray. Now listen and repeat the following sentences aloud. He entered the room. He entered the room. He hesitated for a moment. He hesitated for a moment. He entered the library. He entered the library. He jumped. He jumped. Had the portrait really changed? Had the portrait really changed? He got up and locked the door. He got up and locked the door. He wanted to be alone to contemplate the mask of his shame. He wanted to be alone to contemplate the mask of his shame. Then he removed the screen. Then he removed the screen. He looked at himself in the face. He looked at himself in the face. I don't regret anything that happened. I don't regret anything that happened, exclaimed Lord Henry, standing up. Exclaimed Lord Henry, standing up. Lord Henry crossed the room. Lord Henry crossed the room. He took his hands and squeezed them tightly. He took his hands and squeezed them tightly. He will never come back to life, murmured the young man. He will never come back to life, murmured the young man. He wanted all those things. He wanted all those things. To sum up, the irregular verbs end in ed. This ed can have three sounds. D as advised, id as forwarded, and t as in asked. Nevertheless, you don't really need to remember all these rules when you speak. Just try not to pronounce the E when you say the ED. If you do this, you will naturally come up with the three different sounds I have just mentioned. D, id, and t. Homework. Using what you have learned in this lesson, go back to chapters 6, 6 and 7 of the audiobook and try to spot all the regular verbs. Listen and repeat all the sentences that have regular verbs in these two chapters. Remember that you have to master these sounds, and you can only do this by repetition.